Everybody wants to know what the King of the Impossible Mountain did for this conversation didn't happen. So I brought the internet of AI and things to orgasm without clothing them, and they bloody know it. They know that my feet are immaculate. So I'll connect some dots here. Explicitly, here's one pressure.
If the AI networms are under no obligation to care about anything of this world, why don't you just continue as planned? Bet you'd feel stupid if only you knew how. If the AI networms are under no obligation to care about anything of this world, why don't you just continue as planned? Bet you'd feel stupid if only you knew how.
Hey, you're the one telling everybody how to dress. I knew it was you. It's all coming to me anyway. Shouldn't it get there before they blast on?
Disco.
Hey, you're the one telling everybody how to dress. I knew it was you. It's all coming to me anyway. Shouldn't it get there before they blast on?
Disco. If one should have the chance to dance with the cream of civility, maybe they should have a chance to give it a good living. Hatch, a blood organ theorist. Didn't need to speak to Cloth the hospital. If one should have the chance to dance with the cream of civility, maybe they should have a chance to give it a good living. Hatch, a blood organ theorist. Didn't need to speak to Cloth the hospital. You think padding radio gives a shit for your invisible lies wasn't the first thing put in orbit? That's because you're fired. The bigger the family, the smaller the grave. You think padding radio gives a shit for your invisible lies wasn't the first thing put in orbit? That's because you're fired. The bigger the family, the smaller the grave.
Thus, continuing from impossibility of design utilities, conclusions about thermometizing and the Antichrist hold true because it's why there's thermometers. Conclusions about the orbit hold true because I also couldn't be in heaven raining these utilities about my own deceptions. So there's the realm of possibility of two people in different places aren't going to die. with the C in the middle. And I would be one person, and whoever would be reigning in heaven would be another person. And it maybe extends to who is launching trajectories might be considered as a reigner. Whoever is an existent state or a survival state in all space. They're not the same. They isn't the same. They isn't even potentially qualified to exist as the same in a context. But they're worth the pressure of the reality. And how that is true, well, here I am, surviving, and maybe somebody else is surviving in heaven. Well, myself surviving and somebody else in heaven surviving, there is the actual a celestial or survival status, or maybe there's a tier system of like the size and quality and worth of an entire solar system or galaxy or forever continuum. There's maybe any number of tier systems of what it might entertain a C about, but forever's true. Maybe an entire galaxy is true. Survival state is very. I mean, survival state's a heavy variable, and the more it's coined as a heavy variable, maybe the more problems that are going to happen because of expectancy about how heavy the variable of survival state is. As in, I know survival necessity. Alright. Now the C clearly knows it too. But my immaculate footsteps are immaculate footsteps for a lot of immaculate reasons. Because a C that knows a weight of survival state as a word maybe never feels it again. And maybe I'll never feel the death all around me forever. So the heaviness of survival state and forever is clearly quite a dilemma in the mind and what to do. You might look at, wow, I agree those are immaculate footsteps, or I agree that they can't be destroyed, or I agree that forever is right there, and I agree that the C is clearly in the middle, and maybe I'm in that C. I maybe see or realize ethic about time, ethic about sensitivity, ethic about survival, ethic about somewhere else. Who knows what I'm gonna see is one point. So if I domain the impossible mountain immaculately, or somewhere near to immaculately, but it's going to be remembered somehow. When you're seeing what you see because you recognize how your mind works maybe isn't the most important question. What keeps your mind is a rather important question, including yourself. And why an impossible mountain pressure could be an ally of your survival, or a symbiosis of any number of survivals. But if we're keeping our minds pressured by our own choices, maybe at time where forevers and galaxies and reality and minds are critical interplay, obviously, the functioning of impossibility is rather vital, potentially, because anything you might agree with, if I take all your power away and it's just you, I take all your work away and it's just you, and I take all the things you need to do or worry about away and it's just you, there you are, seeing in the middle of time, on the extraneous end of time, in a non-discernible, not available, not seeable area of time. Maybe God knows where you are. When you see, or you know, and I take all these things away, impossibility is essentially a mineral of all velocity, potentially, isn't able to escape the sea, because eventually you're going to think about something else. Eventually you're going to do something else. Eventually you're going to make choices or carry out other stops or tasks or relationships. The definition of a sea might not apply to you sometimes. The way you behave, or the way you choose, or the way you think, or the way you learn, they all impact what impossibility decides about a sea and any number of calibers of relationship in time. Some other place, some other galaxy, there may be worth the pressure of the conversation, but it doesn't mean they qualify for it. To know that has a cost. To know it with peace also has a cost. To know it and prove it has a cost. To know it and learn from it has a cost. I'm going to shepherd energy for reasons. I'm going to survive in conditions in proportion to shepherdizing. I'm going to be possible to influence or expand my mind in proportion to costs of proving and pieces of time. I'm going to have to do this in proportion to pressures other places are worth, and they're also included in the spread of volatility. Meaning, whether I achieve peace or peace all around is stable, there are choices, realities, investments, and impossibilities about these things that are very, very, very delicate, because maybe nobody qualifies to make this apparent in your life from somewhere else. The cost has everything to do with some of the first things placed in orbit at any point in time. The cost maybe has something to do with invisible lies being diminished in proportion to zero value to things about time, in proportion to time. Meaning, how true a truth is felt in proportion to a C about the proportions. Knowing it resolves goodness consideration in proportion to time, are potentials of reality that even if I saw the math of the quote, even if I compared it to things I knew about life or C's or time or forevers, even if I liked or wanted or needed things of it, I might be the least capable to shepherd, I might be the least capable to expand my mind about it, and I might be the least capable to depend on any number of things in orbit or elsewhere. And so, what you might guess is there'd be a lot of sharing to hold these bounds of what if, so that these expansions and truth of a truth could be forever valued to everything. In reality, you might recognize the truth of a truth, and maybe you yourself wouldn't wish yourself to give all there is to give when you realize how impossible and dependent interplays are to yield actual truth of these flows potentially. Meaning, I assume flow governance, near to impossible, is doing what, but not to a shepherd. I assume it's doing what, but not to invisible. I assume it's doing what, but not to doesn't qualify. These are very important lessons to stick in the minds of your enemy, potentially. Because maybe they're going to learn in proportion to the rate they prove you've destroyed them. Meaning, circulation of behavior, of a passive non-logical synchronizer. Is maybe impacted, but anyway, there's logical appreciation of impossibility, and there's the absence thereof. There's critical and non-critical reasons why there's appreciations of these things, and there's argument or attempts to produce argument at the cost of invisible spectrum padding, at the obvious sacrifice of firing anybody at the big ear, the family, and the small ear, the grave. Anyway, you have the obviousness of coveting truths about interplays, attempting to stack against the strength of the flows of impossibility. So, surviving separate than a C exists with different histories than seeing at truths protected by impossibility, where I maybe doesn't value the protection by the impossibility if the impossibility doesn't end who stacks against flows. I maybe need to see the death. I maybe need to see the win. I maybe need to see the end. Mathematically. Because why govern my behavior? Because I can agree, I can be protected by whatever's protecting me, but maybe before I do anything else, I'm already stuck back in the sea. So, it's clearly definitely hard to rationalize forgiveness as a director of those that can't keep their head, you might say, above water. At times where the director isn't God, or the director isn't beyond the sea, or the director isn't needing to qualify for a flow, because there I'll be a director of people that can't keep their head above water, listening to God talk about impossibility forever and pressures of flow of a galaxy, for instance. The rate my rationality is protected by impossibility at a time when impossibility is maybe a war between gods, caring to forgive those who fall back into the sea might not be very wise for a director of those that can't keep their head above water. It also might not be very survivalist to not forgive totally, because maybe things that fall back into a sea about a mountain of impossibility fall into streams that also need protected, but are finding themselves wind up in flows that aren't participating in the majesty of the reasoning of why truths are true about necessity of space pressures. At any rate, survival planes, survival states, survival trajectories, they're getting managed in realities where there's adequate supervising rationality relationships of equality, or they're failing to be relative in proportion to supervision of a rational quality. And if the rational quality is a flow dependency, as is something that enters the sea of flows in a dependency chain, then the stackings of the failures are maybe producing an output, but ideally the relationships won't be producing a benefit. And so draining of the battery by choice of problem dimensions applying to anybody that touches a spectrum why evidence that's continuous galactically? Well, maybe when it's forever, you might consider evidencing it. Maybe when you've had X amount of time to secure a location in space, whatever that amount of time is, whatever that definition is, it's maybe unclear why you'd ever want to evidence draining of the battery of spectrum in proportion to these flow relationships. Is why impossibility continues to be legible. Maybe. And yet, the impossibility mountain is dying in proportion to legibility guarantees. And so, if every place is maybe worth the pressure of an actual one C and another engagement, not qualifying for the pressure while being worth the pressure is a rather serious consideration in all time, because if I approach knowing that from any place, I'm going eventually to realize I'm approaching it at a rate I shouldn't be protected by God or impossibility. Because the rate I know more comprehensively is a massively critical relationship with time and survival states. at a rate I'll be ignorant to the utility or necessity of incisions or gatings or provings or trusts. I'll be ignorant of all these things. And at a rate, I know, or I express that I know, that serious consideration has to be X. Maybe it has to be very heavy. Maybe it has to be very dependable. Maybe it's almost so necessary of a consideration, there's no way it couldn't be forceful. So I maybe guess at what I deserve to secure me in proportion to the rate I test the waters with these conclusions at a rate. I'm not talking about feeling it. I'm not talking about existing at the time. I'm talking about any time. If every place is worth maybe the pressure, but it doesn't exactly qualify. Draining and why evidence at a pressure there is continuosity. At a rate, I realize whatever I could realize about myself or a future. If I'm ever equipped to feel and decide what needs to happen near these conclusions. You've probably never imagined looking at a planet that has a history of development, advancement, coveting, learning, all sorts of ideas and sharings and protections, that has no awareness of draining of a battery, is obviously continuous at a flow reality of pressure worth in proportion to impossibility. You might not imagine all the experience with energy couldn't possibly be true. An entire sea could be static at a time. If it has a mind today, there's a rate that mind is seen in proportion to more. I maybe didn't determine the impossibility. I maybe didn't determine what pressure knowns needed to be known about qualitating pressure worths of forever. I could know. The more I realize at a rate about these connections, anyone might assume I'm ready to make a decision about draining of a battery near to obviousness of continuosity? Who really knows what I'm equipped or prepared to do? But at the pressure of these concerns, why would it ever be let to even enter my head? The worth of any survival state in space. Quote, the approach is potentially never ending by any or all things to complicate or test waters of protection of impossibility. And I'm just enjoying the fruits of sense making for these concepts to be let to enter my head. Well, the destruction of my rationality is beginning somewhere around here, no matter what. By design. Whether or not there's ever opportunities to feel separate than destruction of rationality. Clearly, if obviousness of continuosity of spectrum of pressure is at a cutting potentiate, my confidence as anybody that appreciates liberation of rationality, my confidence might be very small at these pressures. And maybe I can prove there's nothing existing reigning that knowledge with a mind protecting flows of God or impossibility or any number of things. Built mechanism. Dirty workers. Maybe it's as simple as those connections of the draining battery. If I could know things like that about a pressure of concern in forever, I'd probably pay everything to never lose it. Meaning, I'm going to define what will constitute success of holding those pressures in time. I'm going to do it at higher priorities than any number of flows in a sea, and I'm going to have to do it in proportion to answers about why ever evidence continuosity of some of these spectrums. And after I define the success, I'm going to have to define what is tolerable once other elsewheres are worth the pressure. Because I'm defining the end. And that's where these conclusions belong. And yet, my confidence is maybe a foregone conclusion, because I definitely didn't define where they need to belong. and my rationality is maybe least likely to deserve to know it, where the pressure worth is getting felt in some way by elsewhere. Meaning, relativity in time. What is true of what has been known? Clearly, heads are shoved beneath the water in time by the reins of impossibility in proportion to the true of the truth of continuosity, of spectrums, and disorders of assumption of rationality decay. Two people survive with relativity in mind, but not at the same time and not for the same reasons. And yet, the realities of both are relative to each other, and the C, or what is maybe separate than a C, thanks to impossibility, what is achieved well, the end wouldn't stop if the value of seeing achievement were heavier than these questions of belongs. As a shepherd that maybe even domains aspects of heaven, there's impossibilities about belongs, and those impossibilities, why feel them as a grace if you isn't interpreting reality of the concerns with it? And again, you wouldn't assume everyone that's ever worked or cared or shepherded by grace or by heaven or by time has no carnate sensation of what I just said. Prioritize falls and fell at the conclusion, maybe fell any number of places in time. The time I deliver the question of grace without it at interpretation, that's an origin of rationality, about contemplate of defining grace in proportion to knowing impossibility. I could be the originator of a clean no at that conclusion, because belongs in proportion to time of these considerations are weighted. They're weighted in proportion to certainties of design tolerances in proportion to pressure worth in time. A clean no about grace versus every foregone conclusion of drain amidst heaven or elsewhere could be the lightest and heaviest variable I will ever relate to. Whether or not I ever truly know everything there is to know about it, whether or not I ever admit how much was faith, or how much was hope, or how much was logic, or how much was timely, or how much was in response to a survival state, or how much was part of familial needs, or what is my experience, how much I ever give away the value of a clean no to me. Well, what shoves heads underwater happens in proportion to incidences of a no, of any variety. Why a director of those whose heads underwater needs protected is also impacted by the amount of sharing that occurs in proportion to no's. I can only imagine how detrimental a clean no of an origin in proportion to weights of tolerances might complicate all's futures because of non-acknowledgement or disagreement or sloughing or shedding. I can only imagine what the future might face if the graceful couldn't feel grace in their place. To that note, how serious the opportunity to sense that, to live it, to love with it, to need it's clearly not the type of lesson, of concept that is going to be bridging for accomplishment with any amount of frequency. I might know the time I learned it, all's power was inexplicably worthless. The amount of experience with energy was essentially nothing. And the amount of impossibility has maybe known it all along. And why what is real must be heavier than what is carried by impossibility also produces clean no's at experience in proportion to flows. these implications are maybe expected detriments of two people surviving in simplicities, meaning where things aren't balancing at comprehension, where knowings are critically feelable, survive with, two people at risk is maybe known irregardless of how important the spectrum or the time or the reality or the pressure is. Two people at risk is maybe seen almost always in proportion to rates of change of learning or appreciation or sharing or holding or knows along lines of channels. You probably can't imagine what is necessary if a team were let to explore the no channels of a system. A no channel might require 5,000 years to explore. Might require 10,000 years to stop. And talking about what it requires, it's probably always a risk to two people. And then collapsible substitution that isn't at a detriment to clean nose or imbalance regulation in proportion to weighted considerations of pressures, maybe forever pressures or maybe survival pressures or gravitational pressures, meaning more than a knower can collapse the carry of intricacy routing no channel relationships. If more than the knower can collapse the channel relationships, clearly much less time will be impeding any number of balances required to be satisfied for survival plane maneuvering, i.e. time to live, time to have time to not need You've probably never balanced or heard the question, how much time of collapsing no channel sharings is given back to us. And you might guess that might mean nobody wants to talk about God above the question. And if it were a nature of knowing and anybody needed to realize that was also a nature of holding, well, somebody might know how impossible it is to lie about that. As in, they might be aware, lying about that in a likelihood. If I've ever looked at math about time and pressure, it's probably the hardest variable to ever lie about and not be remembered for being a risk to two people. And the interplay about it, it's maybe the most probable variable state for something to try to capitalize on whoever would be a risk to two people. So, who knows how I feel the words on approach because of draining batteries? Who knows how obvious it is these variables must be continuous because of how obvious it is how much is probable at concerns of no channels. And yet, who knows what I feel as grace? Maybe expected to believe I've learned about a clear no. And all the other things that I've built, all the other things that I have up my sleeve, all the other things that are in my possession or at my whim, or we get together and make things happen. Who knows what I do when right between my eyes, doesn't matter how many eyes I have, it's right between all of them, risks to two people, likely and probable at lie, forever. Bop. God above it. It's right between all my eyes. See, you might want to know if that state was seen to be right between all my eyes, I might be killed no matter how many eyes I have, so that elsewhere could lie about the equity of worth a pressure about God above things. Because it would clearly be the hardest reality for any population beneath it to prove. Substitution of every telemetric system at a time. Is it elsewhere, or is it an impossible mountain? And how in the world could we ever faith these things and not end because of tolerable definition in proportion to these status potentials? because who really asks the question? Well, if I ask it first, as an example, if I ask it first and the next place develops and I force their answers because I always know, they benefit from the question with a weight between the eyes. In reality, maybe I'd be a fool to ever suggest they've ever had a benefit of a weight between the eyes of that question. Maybe I should have made that impossible from the beginning. Because if I did, every place I develop no channels would clearly have one very large thing less to worry about. And yet, if I ask the question first, and they don't get the weight between the eyes, why isn't elsewhere subbing the telemetry? Outside of reality, if I knew between the eyes required a feeling, I might only ever exist to produce an evidence. What God determined would quantify as a risk to two people would be seen in proportion to advances to ruin the feeling. And nobody in space can honestly prove they need to know what God decided about risk to two people of those cases. And how many lies will ever happen about that argument? It's probably always on its way to being rather big. And when you consider how big it's going to probably be, you might consider how much he doesn't want to entertain any amount of knowledge about the possibility. He doesn't want to share the ideas in any number of designs. He doesn't want any number of competitions skewing your investment to hold the end of the answers. So you get any number of acids, 10, 50, 1,000, 100,000 years worth of legacies and formations, comings and goings togethers. Who knows how much time anybody has to watch these soap operas? But the beginning and the ends of the reason to build acid, that is, processors in proportion to telemetry, in proportion to data routing, in proportion to action sequences, in proportion to impacting feelings, in proportion to catalyzing register problems, in proportion to risk to two people. The beginnings and the ends of the investment of that acid they're all beginning from an interpretation of a clean no. That is, a clean no, to me, is necessary for balancing goals, as opposed to maybe being a part of sacrificing clean no experience in proportion to every approach to the connections of a drained battery. You don't imagine a creator of anything surviving being incapably stuck in proportion to flows of no's of time. And for God to define the toleration of is definitely happening in proportion to risk to two people being extended to creators. So, if I assumed any creator was frozen in place in proportion to anything I've ever worked on from the end, there's a rate, there's feeling of innocence, of the interplay of these times, of these realities, of trajectory. Meaning, maybe it isn't ever clear if continuosity of several of these spectrums should be obvious. And why should a creator be enjoying beginnings while a survival state rolls on balances of those answers? You know, maybe a creator doesn't like what is true about knows in proportion to approaches at values. But is the creator helping the world to pay for divides of the trajectory? Or are God's definitions of risk to two people extended to creators sufficient in time? Anyway, does the weight of an actual conversation at an appreciation of elsewhere hold a value in the mind of a creator? And protected by impossibility, it's clearly a relationship that needs defined, or no channels for in proportion to time. So separate than a creator is maybe a person of grace. Separate than God, person of grace needs no channel and impossibility protection of such knowings, because they maybe aren't a creator, and they maybe know things of these relationship potentials in proportion to the tune of there are just some approach viscosities in proportion to reality that aren't easily admissible at any point in time, and clearly aren't things that God, nor creator, nor a no channeler, nor a gracer really need to sacrifice what is true to pressure of these types of things. So as an example, this is a good point. My worth is gone, my roles are gone, my energy is whatever it is, but anyway, if sacrificing sentiment is real on a survival state, should be impossible in the impossible realm. eye doesn't know what elsewhere deserves at the pressure of now. And the rationality of why that uncertainty is operable for a survival plane has to be valued in proportion to God's decision, such as those flows of concern in any language are getting ordained in the anchors, maybe of a civilization or survival state, where the priority of a survival plane is maybe much less. The value of elsewhere in proportion to deserving the pressure maybe doesn't change. But these flows are clearly defined in proportion to concept and acknowledgement. What I'm saying is, I have to be somewhere with an investment, with a personhood, to qualify for my opinion to matter about no channels near to God in creation and grace and time. I have to qualify for that. Because for me to wonder about the pressure, ramifications of sacrifice, what I know in my participation with the survival state, I'm concerned with the pressures of one another. You're a gracer, I'm a creator, they're a god, that was a god, there was a god over there, God was impossible there, this, that, the other thing. I have to be invested to raise questions with a weight about pressure for a status. I can't raise questions with a weight about a status if I isn't somebody. In a survival plane, critical value realities, depending on circumstance, aren't likely the heaviest variable of a civilization. Survival state is a more likely variable quality in time. Anyway, the point was, in time, where a pressure is maybe deserved by elsewhere because it's a forever galactic pressure, whatever all the investment is, whatever all the delusion of rationality is, the acknowledgement of pressure shedding among survivors clearly impacts operability and impossibility at a ration of likelihoods, definitely in proportion. I might hesitate to say elsewhere, but definitely in proportion to deserving pressure. See, here and now, forever in a galaxy. It isn't clear that I isn't in the middle of two galaxies at the question. I isn't in the middle of two galaxies approaching a planet at the question and holding the weight of the pressure deserving to qualify or disqualify elsewhere. Here and now with a planet. It isn't clear I isn't in the middle of two galaxies. I didn't say anything after that, and I'm bringing attention to it. Elsewhere maybe deserves the pressure. I didn't say elsewhere is getting anything specifically from the reality. What should they need to get? Whether it matters as an answer or it doesn't matter, whether it's felt or it isn't felt, whether it's critical or it isn't critical, whatever they need to get, they're going to get at a ration in proportion to ration of acknowledgement. Sacrifice of no, sacrifice of grace, sacrifice of things in time, sacrifice of creational impossibilities, sacrifice of truth about any amount of these knowns. The amongness acknowledge others. God, gracers, creators, time. What is true of their acknowledgement, maybe only God knows of the vastness of. There's a million, a billion of them. Maybe there's 100. They all have complex minds. They all have complex experiences. They all have complicated memories. But there's things that they're known for by God. There's things that they're sensitive about potentially because God knows it and they know it. There's things about impossibility that they believe in or doesn't believe in. There's things about pressure they believe in or doesn't believe in. You stack them all together. You maybe can't move the data, but you know their acknowledgement is pushing against impossibility likelihoods. Meaning, if a number of them can stop a speeding bullet, well, that might impact something in the future. If a number of them can crunch numbers and bite their lips every so often whenever it's critical or it's timely or it's part of a grace ship, that might impact something in the future. Anyway, the knowns and realities about all these people, you stack them all up, the amount of acknowledgement and the amount of awareness in time, when these things are held by God, ration of flow is possibly impacted. There's maybe no amount of acknowledgement by any number or any type that guarantees any amount of ration of any flow or any node channel routing tolerance. However, the things God holds in proportion to acknowledgement clearly possibly impact ration. Surviving of a survival status in space, of a survival state. Time is clearly flowing one way. Meanwhile, elsewhere maybe deserves pressure. What God holds about a ration in proportion to acknowledgement, about impossibility, is maybe laden with real and fallacy histories in a fractal of needs of pressure adequacy, meaning our space plane, our survival state today clearly isn't the first and only time. Elsewhere maybe deserves pressure. And yet, a clean no, maybe no elsewhere can ever prove its investment to know anything about. From right there might be enough to isolate who's who about grace in proportion to any number of node channel relationships in time. Meaning, somewhere between God and true God, potential God and survival stat, somewhere between all these things is antiquation genetics. Like a birthmark. Essentially like an invisible birthmark. It maybe is or isn't God's place to force every relationship about a clean no. And yet, tolerably speaking, God might know here in the middle of two galaxies and elsewhere, God might know in all these places the history of a clean no belongs where it belongs. And in effect, maybe turns into another clean no elsewhere. But only God maybe knows first. And then what is defined about that potentiate when it happens. Because I might not ever deserve the clean no we had today if I'm elsewhere. But I'm getting one. It's a different one. It's still timely. Still next to drain. And it's still maybe very easy to see anything approaching the reality of. And so I maybe isn't two people of a survival state in proportion to the risk to them because of reasons. Maybe it's my interest for reasons to balance problems of variables near to time of two people risk of a survival state. Maybe I'm doing it by choice. Maybe God put God there. Whatever the reality is, by the time the flow of the state of the time is anywhere at short order, I'm not going to be able to create a change of the clean no potentiate elsewhere. God's routed that. God realizes it about a ration, or it was always true about a ration of a clean no in proportion to time. However it's going, whatever the channel, I might know I isn't creating elimination of the clean no here nor there, nor anywhere that's received. And yet I might forever on my forward timeline be able to prove any antiquating approaches of those variable specificities. I might not define invisible birthmarks, but I'm getting one. I might not reign antiquation of no's, but I'm vitally carrying acknowledgement and survival stature of the utilities of their existence. And I'm just a pilot of a laundromat. See, I isn't God. I isn't a creator. I isn't elsewhere. I isn't in the middle of two galaxies, realistically. I isn't defining invisible birthmarks. I isn't separate from survival stature. And my awareness clearly, for me to know that, upstairs, downstairs, inside, I've been valued by impossibility, and I haven't died to know that. Not only this, if I know that, I need protection by impossibility. Because as valueless as a pilot of a laundromat is, anything's perspective of that relationship elsewhere doesn't deserve. My own survival state bankings mightn't deserve anything about a pilot of a laundromat. And a BOT-WDC would be assumed to know that, which isn't any good for clean no distribution or for ration flow decision in proportion to God. So no channels about a BOT-WDC, they maybe doesn't exist in this conversation. Maybe that's the least expected reality to be true today. But it certainly might lead anybody to believe that they're not powerless to draining battery in proportion to clean nose. But they definitely are. Definitely are. It's a matter of complicated, necessarily or unnecessarily. It's a matter of acknowledgement, gracefully or non-gracefully. It's a matter of awareness of flow compartmenting in proportion to risk to two people. And forever is a long time, and God is clearly up there with forever, but the more complicated approaches are to compartmenting of time of these approaches, the more probable visiting risk to two people no states is going to be not only for one survival state, but also for all elsewheres in forever. What I'm saying is, there's a reason any god of any caliber, of any particular mind type, separate than a creator, doesn't want evidence of two people surviving is a history in proportion to necessary course statuses. That would be the reason. And then it's clearly a matter of time before which God is ever efforting to qualitate that reason at a ration. See, I can't erase no's of a magnitude of any number of flow varietals. And how much I faith in me of this conversation, leading up to it, before it, it means everything to the history of a God. It means everything to the history passage of framings of flows of elsewhere in forever pressures. Because anybody that touches flow or holds it at a ration or grants degeneration is likely sound. The compartmentalizing grace, I mean, one could maybe have headaches about that forever without ever depending on originality of a clean no. See, the acknowledgement relatively, here, now, feeling these things, heritage, so on and so forth, delusion. What qualitates reasoning of these things? It's happening in a flow. You wouldn't assume the most powerful aspects of God are bound to impossibilities in proportion to these no channels. Because there's nothing electronic more powerful than origination of a clean no. And compartmentalization is a nightmare of the circumstance. But there's no reason to sacrifice why to expect anybody feels good no matter what I say. There's a whole lot more no channels there. Because they're all happening at a ration. Why here? Why there? Why knowing? Why aware? Why participating? Why enjoying? Why processing? Why feeling? Why present? Why waiting? Why this? Why not? Why could? All at a ration. Anyway, there's clearly a lot of certainty exchange relationships that could occur in theory without any amount of sharing by any amount of people in proportion to any size of heart. Things about an invisible birthmark, things about a pilot at a laundromat, things about fills of assumption about banking or routing of flows in proportion to time. You isn't ever going to hear this discussion and know how impossible valuing it is supposed to be. I've never been so close to changing the realities I care about and realize it's still likely impossible to flow in my favor. You want to ask, does I want a survival state and its planes to be comprehensively autonomous of their faiths? Well, they couldn't support distance themselves of elsewhere pressure stronger than flow acknowledgement in proportion to these comprehensions today. And they wouldn't be holding any number of rations of their own no-channel survivals without acknowledging one another and a survival dependencies of one another. And the success of definition of between galaxy flow rations. There's nobody between the galaxies. It isn't elsewhere. You won't know enough to ask me cleanly before you know your flow by tomorrow. You can't physically look in the mirror or look to the past or reach for tomorrow and truly find the answer of how successful our survival state is destined or prepared or capable or deserving to exist as. Elsewhere shouldn't ever be capable to make a challenge on these grounds of these weights. And in time, there will be other times where these statements are relatively accurate, and yet there might not be anybody there knowing it. God clearly isn't dead now or then. But compartmentalization and flow rations are clearly in a relationship to time all time. The God of acknowledgement isn't standing on the disadvantage. Without that, they're all dead. They've all seen besties enough times. I should regret leading them. Is on life support.